past 12 years, I worked for Time Warner. I was this Senior Vice President for Public Policy and International Relations for Asia Pacific, based in Hong Kong for about 10 years. And a couple of years ago, moved back to Victoria. So I'm now with the company on a part-time basis in an advisory capacity. So I'm not a journalist, but I think it's fair to say that I was invited here because of media connections, and I'll try and speak a little bit to the media role in all of this. When Richard first asked me to speak on this, the topic was how would the media likely cover the 75th anniversary of the Nanjing massacre. And of course, that's somewhat of a challenge since the 75th anniversary won't take place for about a month. So I really can't foresee exactly how it will be covered, but I can make some guesses. Sure. All right, I hope that's a bit better. So what I did is I contacted a couple of my colleagues within the department, Jaime Forcruz, who's the CNN bureau chief in Beijing. Some of you know Jaime, or Jimmy as he's called. He's been there for about 40 years. He originally went to Beijing as a dissident Filipino student. He was the Time bureau chief in Beijing for many years, and now he's the CNN bureau chief. And I asked him if there are any plans to cover this event, and he said, well, probably not. I mean, CNN does breaking news, it does actuality. This isn't the sort of thing that would typically be covered. Of course, if there were riots in the streets over the 75th anniversary, naturally they would cover it, but it wasn't going to be covered as an event per se. Excuse me. I also talked to my old friend, Sir Abdul Karim, who's the editor of Time Asia, as to whether, excuse me, as to whether Time would be likely to cover it. And he basically said the same thing, that Time now, as then, is a weekly news magazine. It's evolved a bit. It doesn't cover so much the news anymore because everybody's already seen the news, but it does delve a little bit behind the news. But he would be unlikely to cover the 75th anniversary. He thought about maybe, excuse me, commissioning an essay or something like that, but it would be unlikely to be covered. Which made me start to think a little bit, well, supposing the Nanjing incident or event or massacre were to happen today, what would likely be the kind of coverage that would take place? And in fact, how has it been covered over the media? And I think we can recognize, those of you who have looked into it, that the media coverage at the time was important. I was obviously not an expert in this. I kind of gone back and found it quite interesting to look at. There was coverage, but it wasn't, at least what I expected, it wasn't as wide a coverage as was expected. As you will see, I think I will argue that it was significant. The fact that this coverage appeared in the then major newspapers of the time, the New York Times, the Chicago Daily News, London Times, and others, Reuters. But it really wasn't as in your face and as prevalent as one might expect. And it made me think a little bit about the media today. And when you think about the media, you think about what's going on today, the news you saw last night, maybe what you saw this morning, maybe on television, radio, on a website, whatever. The coverage always relates to, first of all, how much information is available, and frankly, what else is happening in the world. And what we get, I think, out of media coverage is a combination of perception and reality. So Professor Larry last night talked about sort of collective memory. And I would submit that a lot of our collective memory is, of course, shaped by the images and the coverage and our own internalization of the information that we receive. Almost all of it, certainly a great deal of it through the media, some from other sources, of course. So if you think about today's reality, I mean, is everything being covered today? Are there wars are happening in recent times. Have there been wars going on, for example, in places in Africa, which were pretty terrible, which frankly didn't get very much coverage? Lately, we have seen a lot of coverage of what's been happening in Syria and Lebanon. It's ongoing coverage. It's still not clear, and even in today's day and age, exactly, for example, what is happening in Syria and Aleppo and Damascus. We've had a few journalists killed in Syria. Marie Colvin from CNN being an example. That just last week, a Japanese photojournalist was killed. So it's the picture is a bit incomplete, a bit in short, as it was indeed in 1937 in Nanjing. So I guess my point is that the coverage and the perception is shaped to a great deal about what gets out. And then that becomes kind of frozen in time and perpetuated and repeated. Of course, we have scholarship that goes back perhaps and overturns some new stones. But by and large, the paradigm is set by the initial sort of media coverage and projection of what happened. There's also another reality that is certainly very current today and was current then, and that is what perhaps euphemistically call the management of the news, but in effect, the breaking up of the news into portions that can be consumed by the public. It's interesting if you've ever thought about why there was always exactly half an hour of daily news. It's not 35 minutes, or it's 25 minutes. There's always 35 minutes. It always expands or contracts to fill what's available. There are editors that sit around and figure out what it is that you're going to see today. So if you've been following what's been happening in Syria over the last couple of weeks, you will notice there hasn't been very much on Syria in the last few days. We've heard a lot about General Petraeus and Paula whatever her name is, and so on. The last couple of days we've heard a lot about Gaza and Israel. Nothing much about Syria. Maybe nothing is going on in Syria for the last couple of days, but frankly I doubt it. I suspect it would be a quiet news cycle. There would have been some stories out of Syria. So there was always this issue of management of the news as well and the broader context. And I think that was probably true in 1937 and the role of the media at that time. Now the names that are normally quoted as being very significant are Tilman Durden, who was the reporter for the New York Times, who was in Nanjing on the 13th of December when the Japanese army entered, Archibald Steele from Chicago Daily News, Leslie Smith from Reuters, and his articles appeared in the London Times. It was 1937. In those days, you filed a copy through the telegraph office. It was hard to get the news out. It was wartime and so forth. And in fact, the first news, I believe, appeared on the 18th of December in the New York Times. Tilman Durden lived to a ripe old age, and he was around in the 90s, I think, when Iris Chang published her book as well. I noted that going back and looking at some of the early stories, the London Times had a story on the 18th of December. 5 days after the Japanese entry into Nanjing, called Terror in Nanjing. What I was surprised to find out is that it was on page 12. It was sort of a narrow column. It was beside some banal conversation of something going on at Durham Castle and various other things. So, I mean, it's an issue of, again, of context. Time magazine covered it, not extensively. And perhaps again this reflects either the management of the news or the availability of information. So Time had 3 articles about Nanjing on the 27th of December, the 14th of February, the 18th of April 1938. The one on December 27th is quite interesting. And if you know anything about journalism, you know, of course, you have your headline. And then the first paragraph is really about what the story is, and then you sort of dig down further into the story. So you write a long column, and if the editor's only got room for the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, the story is still there. So it's interesting to look at what the headline is and how the story led, and it perhaps gives us, excuse me, a bit of a sense. So the headline was not the rape of Nanjing. In fact, I can't find out who actually coined that phrase. It just seems to have popped out at the time. The headline was "Foreign News at the Tomb." And it led off not with a direct story about the massacre, but this way. General Iwani Matsui, called the Long-Eared General, a traditional Japanese sign of welcome, last week made his triumphal entry into captured Nanjing, the abandoned Chinese capital, outside whose walls stand the $3 million tomb of sainted Dr. Sun Yat-sen. General Matsui entered the city 4 days after its surrender. General Matsui, of course, is one of the few Japanese officers executed for war crimes, and it was for his responsibility for Nanjing. That historic moment meant more to General Matsui than it would to most Japanese, for Revolutionary Sun spent many years in Japan, became a close friend of Matsui, who took up the doctrine of Pan-Asianism, to which the grateful Dr. Sun at the time enthusiastically subscribed. That's the first paragraph. At the last meeting of his old friend, it was General Matsui's, the last resting place of his old friend, it was General Matsui's duty last week to complete the butchery of those Chinese troops, tragically misled, who, against the advice given by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's German military advisors, had been left to defend Nanjing. It was a tiresome job, lining up hundreds of prisoners and shooting them down batch after batch. And the story then goes on, of course, to talk about some of the events, and then concludes with a very long paragraph about setting up the puppet government in Beijing. So it's interesting that this, at least to me, looking at Time magazine, who was not unfamiliar with China. Henry Luce, of course, was born in China. He provided a lot of coverage of China. Chiang Kai-shek, in fact, was on the cover of Time magazine no less than 10 times, from 1927 through 1955, and on January the 3rd, which I guess would have been the edition following this, he and Madame were man and wife of the year on the cover of Time. Yet the next reference of any sort to appear in Time did not come out until the 14th of February. So I guess the first point is that in sort of looking back at the context, this was not headlines, rape of Nanjing. It was there in the context of many, many other things. In fact, there's far more coverage of the bombing of the USS Panay at the time, and the Japanese reaction to it and apology, etc., than there was on this particular event. Nonetheless, it was covered. It was covered in the New York Times. It was covered, as I say, in the Chicago Daily News and so on. I think the important thing is, what if it had not been covered? As it is, some of the deniers will say, well, how come there wasn't more coverage? I mean, why the Western correspondents are supposed to have gone in with the Japanese army and there was very little coverage of this and so forth. In fact, there was coverage. These reports were difficult to get out. They took a few days to get out, but in fact, I think, although there have been many more reports that have come out through diaries and the reports of the missionaries and so forth, it was the fact that it was in the international media, the Western media, interesting, not very much in the Chinese media, that in a sense gave legitimacy to this, and in fact has shaped a lot of our collective memory. So now, fast forward 50 years to the publication of Iris Chang's book. Again, another example of the media enshrining a particular view of history. Her book was 10 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. A lot of coverage, reviews, etc., and of course it brought events to the consciousness of a whole new generation of people as to what happened in Nanjing. In the few minutes left, I'd like to turn a little bit to the Chinese media and how it has been covered or conveniently ignored or conveniently highlighted. Professor Wu indicated the history of Nanjing in certainly in recent times, since the founding of the People's Republic, and how there was very little coverage. It, of course, is far more coverage today. When you just to come back really to the role of the media, Japan, I guess, has many things to answer for in China and elsewhere. But it's the fact that this particular event seems to have been frozen in time. You can go back and look at the New York Times or Time magazine. So Nanjing, in effect, has become now the proxy for much of what happened. And it's periodically, of course, resurfaced. Most recently over the Senkaku Diaoyutai issue, but also because of the textbook issues in 2005 the comfort women, the sex slaves, and so forth. What I want to talk a little bit about, of course, is the role of the Chinese government, or really the Chinese government and its role vis-a-vis the media in terms of the way the issue is handled today. The most recent iteration of discomfort and inflaming in public opinion and so forth goes back to 2005, when the Japanese textbooks, there was a controversy over the revision of Japanese textbooks. The question that aroused usual demonstrations in China, large numbers of people being, protesting against the Japanese embassy, Japanese business, and so forth. The question, of course, is how would the population of China be aware of the fact that, maybe in some relatively obscure prefecture in Japan, there'd been a whitewashing of history. Well, of course they knew about it because it was front and center of the Chinese media. So clearly there's a role for the media, or the government sees a role for the media in bringing this issue to the forefront. Most recently, I happened to be looking, sort of trolling through the web, came across another story of anti-Japanese demonstrations. Furious Chinese protest makes old anger over Japanese occupation with modern dispute over islands. This wasn't so much the actual Senkaku dispute as the 81st anniversary on the 18th of September of the beginning of the war in 1931. So there are many anniversaries that can be marked, that can be used, if you like, to work up people's opinions and to perhaps, I hate to use the word manipulate, but to bring to the consciousness of people the fact that this historical event took place, and in fact perhaps use it for contemporary purposes. I'll give you actually a personal example from the company. A few years ago, Warner Brothers was actually operating theaters in China. It has since exited the market. And one of the reasons perhaps for this is the unhappiness of the Chinese government at what a foreign company might do. Back in 2005, the company was told that there would be petitions against the Japanese, and that petition booths or desks would be set up in all theaters. Warner Brothers management at the time said they didn't think this was a terrific idea. Warner operated theaters in Japan in partnership with the Michael company. How about if the petition booths were set up outside in the mall and so forth? This didn't go over very well, and in fact, it's interesting, it may not be directly connected, but I think there was a connection. Shortly after that, it was decided that foreign companies would not be allowed to operate, at least would not be allowed to have majority share of cinemas in China. So, I mean, these things do get amplified, and in fact, the Chinese government is not beyond using the events of the past to serve the needs of the present. The one area which, of course, is significantly different, I've talked a little bit about what happened 50 or 60 years, 75 years ago, is the role of the social media and the role of the internet. This was alluded to in Professor Wu's comments about civil society and the role of the Chinese populace. I think it would be wrong, in fact cynical, to say that all of the feeling about Nanjing is a result of government manipulation. In fact, I think the Chinese media probably both reflects as well as perhaps mobilizes public opinion from time to time. There's certainly now that there is a greater degree of consciousness, there's a huge amount of discussion on the internet. The internet, of course, for China is a very challenging issue. It's a tiger that it's riding. It amplifies and opens the scope for discussion at times. Other times it contracts it. Certain search terms are allowed to be used, and then suddenly they're not available. They're blocked. There's no question at the time of the most recent demonstrations where there was a very large group of people, what we euphemistically used to call way back when I was in China a renter crowd. Being very organized, allowed to demonstrate in front of the Japanese embassy. Groups were cycled through, they were allowed to throw their bottles of water, their oranges and their tomatoes, and they were moved on. The next group came, and as it started to get out of control, as Japanese cars started to be burned, Japanese cars owned by Chinese citizens, Japanese businesses were attacked, suddenly, it was ratcheted down, and the population was reminded of the way in which it should behave, as happened during the World Cup, or the Asian Cup in soccer, where some Japanese feelings got out of hand. So at the moment, I think China has been able to manage this. It's an extremely challenging proposition for them to ride the tiger. And I think the real story will be how much longer China will be able to actually control the internet. It may be something that they will find much more difficult than they think. So to wrap up, and I see my time is up, I guess the conclusion would be that the media certainly helped make Nanjing as a proxy, part of our collective historical memory. It's really a symbol of what happened, and probably the stand-in for many other events that took place. It did become the event we talked about in large part because it was media and Western media that got the story out, although not perhaps in the way that we would expect. The coverage was incomplete, and it was part of broader coverage at the time, much as the case with media today, where in fact the snippets and images we see are part of the passing collective memory, and maybe it will take scholars in the future time, they'll be at a conference someday, looking back at the incomplete sort of coverage we have of events today, just as we in fact are now looking back at what happened in 1937. Thank you.